Hello, everybody. Welcome to People Op School, where I have the great honor of talking with very people working to make work healthier, more human, and more creative. Joining me today, I have Allie Greene. Allie is the head of culture and community at Oyster, an HR platform for globally distributed teams. She is also the founder of Kohana, where she offers remote work consulting, and she's co-writing a book about remote work right now. All of this is to say, Allie spends a lot of time thinking about how to help teams and humans do the best work remotely. These are some of my favorite topics, so I'm really excited to dive in with you today, Allie.
Thank you, Mary. I'm super excited to be here and geek out about some of these people up topics.
Yeah, let's do it. I always kick off with the same question. People operations can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I love this question. I think in the past few years, there's been this kind of conflicting arguments around human resources and
Mm,
people ops and what does each one mean and what is the perception of them all, and is people ops just a rebranding of HR? And I always
mhm,
said no, it's not. There's enough slight differences that makes it this unique thing, and part of the future of work will be to focus on people operations. So with that said, I always think about it as something that's extremely proactive in
mhm,
organizations and not just in service of other teams within an organization. And for me, it's all about it satisfying what I like to call the three E's. So, like engagement, efficiency, and effectiveness,
mhm,
or more so, just like how do we make the great people that companies hire really good at their job, do their job in a way that doesn't add like stress or unnecessary complexity, and make them really happy to be doing that job and happy to be pushing forward the goals of an organization. And so when I look at it, it's like, how do we have people truly feel those things
mhm,
on a team?
mhm,
And there's lots of different angles that you can then take. So one is the very human element, the very emotional element of creating a good vibe at a
mhm,
company. So like, how do you create trust? How do you make sure an organization is healthy? What does that mean? Like, what is the personality of an organization? What
mhm,
is, I hate using the word culture, but like, what are like, I like to use instead like standard operating behaviors? Like, what behaviors does everybody want to embrace in the organization?
yeah,
And there's a lot of emotional intelligence that needs to go in that. And then I also like to think about people ops, and this might surprise some people or it might sound boring, but the strategy, the processes, the documentation that goes into place to help people learn how to exist as a community member on a team. And so,
mhm,
how can leaders create systems to make their employees' jobs easier? How can leaders create frameworks that help people get to know each other better, especially in
mhm,
remote organizations? How do we structure things so that there's clear company goals and then intentional ways
mhm,
to reach those goals? And sometimes that might fall on a CTO or an engineering director or a sales director, and it might look different for teams in the organization.
yeah,
But I think the more that a people ops person can be part of those conversations and
mhm,
create like a cohesive nature for everyone in the company, the more like the machine is well oiled, if you will, but
yeah.
also people can have fun like taking that machine on a ride.
I like that analogy. I think there's two things that you said that I want to kind of just pull up. The first one being around people ops being a more proactive way to approach organization building, and you mentioned it might be like someone on engineering or a CTO or someone in leadership, that like these systems and processes don't always have to come from someone working in people ops. And then I think the other thing you pulled out that was interesting, and very telling of like your background and experience in remote work, is this focus on systems and process and how they can really a lot of times be in service of autonomy and building these things. And so I'd be curious to hear, um, maybe if you can give like an example of, like to tie those three things all together around how being remote and working in people ops, like what that kind of explicit systems and structures looks like.
Yeah, definitely. So I think like the responsibility of a people ops person, again, going back to those three things: engagement, efficiency, effectiveness. I almost use it as a source of criteria for anything the organization does.
Mm,
So when you think about remote work, a big challenge people often find themselves in is, and especially this is like a fear that managers have that I
mm,
think like honestly is ridiculous. But like managers will say like, how do I know that my employees are working or what they're working on if I can't see them?
Mhm.
My like kind of cheeky gut reaction is always like, well, how did you know they were working when they were sitting in an
Yeah.
office and
Yeah.
not like reading the news online or like dreaming about their vacations that they can take once you know the world opens up again,
Yeah.
um or they get like their PTO. And
Mhm.
so first and foremost, it's like, yes, trust, and we could have a whole separate podcast about the importance of trust. But then it's things like, how can an organization implement rituals and systems to help
Mhm.
people share what they're working on? And there's lots of benefits for that.
Yeah.
So if you have a systemized way for people to share what they're working on, you can make sure there's no duplicative efforts in an
Mhm.
organization. You can make sure that people are focusing on top priorities and things that will be most impactful to a company's goals.
Yeah.
It also gives an opportunity for people to get to know each other and
Mhm.
to be like, oh, this person is working on this project that seems really cool. I don't know anything about like user interface design, but I love that they're updating this new like product
Mhm.
Webflow on our
Mhm.
system. And I've been developing the backend for that product. So
Yeah.
like I want to go talk to this person in the organization and like use this as a way to have a really cool conversation about our work and how we
Mhm.
could better work with each other, even though the pieces of the projects that we work on are usually very separate. And so one thing that you could implement, and like as a people ops person where I see this person helping the organization, is really as that internal coach to really figure out how to structure this and what it looks
Mhm.
like. So for example, this could be just something in Slack where every Monday people sort of post, this is the most important thing I'm working on, this is the company goal it relates to. If you have ideas or questions, like this is the best time to reach out to me.
Mhm.
And also if you're interested in this project or have feedback or things like that, like, and we haven't talked in a while, you know, DM me.
Mhm.
Or it could live in Asana or Notion. It could include things like people's availability or
Mhm.
not. So there's lots of different ways to create a structure that just helps streamline communication in that way.
Yeah. Takes people out of their like guest bedroom, if they're lucky, like actual office in their house,
Yeah,
and connects them to like, oh, we are all working on this thing together.
exactly.
Um, cool. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the work you're doing with Oyster and what it means to be head of culture and community. What does that work look like?
Yeah. So oysters super cool. I was really grateful to find them. I have a bit of a funny, I think, pandemic story
Mm,
where I had left my role as director of people in February, and I had this like grand sabbatical planned. I was going on a ski trip to kick it
mm,
off, and I get to the ski resort and the country goes into lockdown. I was in
yeah.
France,
Mm,
and I always had this like passion that I was trying to figure out of like, there's so many awesome things about people operations, but as a people ops person, normally the impact you have on remote work, on society, on building communities, which are things that are near and dear to my heart, is only
mm,
within one organization. And
mm,
granted, there's amazing things like people ops school where people can share ideas and learn from each other, but you still have a very like narrow window of impact.
mhm,
So I got to know Oyster, which is an HR platform for globally distributed companies to help them make it easier to like hire and pay people and treat these people well,
mm,
regardless of what country they live in. So I was like immediately drawn to this social impact mission. One
mhm,
of my passions around remote work has always been like, yeah, so like yes, of course remote work is beneficial for people. They can choose where to work, they can have opportunities to work in really interesting companies. Yes, it's great for organizations. They can hire amazing talent anywhere. They don't have to pay the overhead cost of an office. But like remote work goes so much deeper
yeah.
than that. So like it can help fight brain drain in developing communities and send
Mhm,
people to like Boise, Idaho,
mhm,
and help cultivate the economy of these like local places all around the world, from
mhm,
Lebanon to Kenya to like rural US.
mhm,
And that's really cool to me. And like what that looks like for changing society is really cool to me. And then there's like this health impact, this
mhm,
family impact. Like, what does it look like if you're a single parent or caring for the elderly, or you have like emotional or physical limitations where an
mhm,
office becomes a really big burden, and how does remote work open the
Yeah.
doors for those groups.
Hmm.
And so just being able to have conversations with companies that care about that like is awesome.
Yeah.
And so Oyster really excited me there. And then
I'm
what's
gonna interrupt you just really quick
yeah, go, of
because
course.
brain drain is a fairly new term for me. I've just learned about it in the last year or
Mhm.
so. So maybe can you just quickly like explain what that is?
Yeah, so not a textbook definition by all means, but the way I perceive it to be is like when historically people have had to rely on really competitive, really interesting jobs, especially in the knowledge market, those things, those jobs would be in San Francisco, London, New York. And so if
Mhm.
you were a potential employee and wanted to work on these opportunities, you would move to those urban areas away from the areas that you live, whether
Mhm.
it's Detroit, Boise, South Africa,
Mhm.
rural Ireland. And so the flux of people leaving those communities to go to these big urban cities leave what's called like a brain drain. Like all of these super intellectual, interesting people are leaving these communities to go to big cities where there's already a lot of density of that type. And so by removing that from the equation, you give access to people to really awesome jobs
Mhm.
and potentially higher pay, and then they can use that and bring it back to their local community and help people in that community get excited for these types of job opportunities, support the local like coffee shops or art studios because they have the money to do so.
Mhm.
So all in all, like it's a huge like win-win solution in my eyes as someone who's also like been there, done that with living in big cities, and it wasn't for me. And
Yeah,
it's like cool to now live somewhere that's off the beaten path.
totally.
And in my daily life, like I'll work at a coffee shop and meet someone who also works for like a tech startup, but then someone who's like a reggae coach and someone who, works in the hospitality region or a yoga teacher. So it's just like, I think adds for like just a cooler personal life.
Yeah, totally. Cool. Um, to get us back on track, um,
Yeah.
I'd love to learn about like the work you're doing at Oyster. What does it mean to be head of culture and community?
Exactly. So that's the second really cool thing about Oyster is because HR is such a core piece of their product, how they view people operations isn't just your traditional, like you're going to be a people ops manager or talent acquisition person.
Hmm.
And so in my role, I'm really tasked with how do I bridge people ops best practices and the challenges and the expertise and the questions that people in our circle face,
Hmm.
and find ways to yes support that internally inside the organization but also externally offer more outlets for people to learn from each other,
Hmm.
to have the resources to solve some of these challenges and to help it potentially impact the product. So if I had to like do the elevator pitch or like TLDR for what I do, it's basically a liaison between best practices around community building and culture and remote work internally, and then
Hmm.
evangelizing that information and sharing it with our community externally as well.
Yeah, I love that. I think um, you and I are definitely biased in terms of being like very big advocates for remote work and have have been lucky that we've both been doing it for a long time pre-COVID. And I feel like we've covered some of the pros of remote work. I think especially that like social impact on communities is a really big one. But then there's also like it's not all amazing, awesome, perfect all the time. And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like for companies who have not been remote for a long time and or have maybe been remote for the past year because of COVID, I'm starting to hear more and more people running into that like, okay, we've been doing this for a year. We were getting by on adrenaline for a while, but now things are kind of hard and we're struggling to think about how to build connection on our team and how to hold events that don't feel like forced fun or inauthentic. And
Yeah.
so, again, you've been doing this for a long time. I'd be curious to hear kind of what you've learned around helping people build that connection and community.
Yeah, definitely. I think first and foremost, like everybody right now just needs to acknowledge that the world is hard.
Yeah.
And you can have the most perfect remote work setup at home. You can have amazing family members at home, or you could be living alone in a studio apartment and trying to make it work. And
Hmm.
obviously, there's like very tactical challenges that each one of those examples might face. But at the
Yeah.
end of the day, like life in 2020 was really hard. Life in
Hmm.
2021, it's
Yeah.
still pretty hard.
Yep.
And like this type of remote work is not the remote work that like you and I have been advocating for and have been experiencing for the past few years. This is
Hmm.
a remote work situation where week to week guidelines and rules and laws and
Yeah.
restrictions on where you're allowed to go are changing, and that creates a lot of anxiety and a lot of uncertainty for the
Hmm.
future. It's hard to look forward to things because of that as
Yep.
well. And you have people with like their children at home, people that have medical conditions that have this added fear because of things going on in the world. And so
Hmm.
like first and foremost, like I think everybody just needs a little bit of like authenticity and humility to like be allowed to have those vulnerable moments
Hmm.
in work. And so
Yep.
like at the office, it's like the equivalent of like having a really bad day and having your office friend you can lean on, and
Yeah.
maybe you go like cry in the bathroom and then you like put on like, you know, your
Yeah.
suit jacket and you go do your work.
Hmm.
Remote work like opens up work to be in people's homes. And if you're
Hmm.
going to physically like be in people's homes because you're doing Zoom calls, then emotionally, like as much trust as you can build to let your employees show those insecurities and show those vulnerabilities, I think creates a culture of authenticity that's really important at work. It makes people
Yeah.
feel connected to each other. It makes them understand and know that the company is supportive of this and everyone's going through it together, and like then they're excited to get the work done, and it gives you something to look forward to. So that's like my little like rant about remote work right now.
Yeah.
But like outside of that, I think remote work's really cool for building community and culture, and this is like why I love what I'm doing right now,
Hmm.
because it's taking away all the fluff and
Yep.
it's making connections real. And
Hmm.
so, like remote work, you can't hide behind like a super cool office with like fun artwork or murals
Yep.
or like free snacks or ping pong,
Yep.
like whatever. I used to work for a startup when I was like first starting my career, and they had a ball pit. Like what? um and like culture is so much more than values written
Yeah.
on a wall. And so like if I had to like describe like how can you think about community building on a remote team,
Hmm.
it's being intentional. And
Yep.
so like what are your goals as a company? What do you want to stand behind in terms of people getting to know each other, and how do you again like create strategies and processes and frameworks to help support those things? So
Hmm.
if it's really important to you that people have a social outlet,
Yep.
how do you create rituals around that social outlet?
Hmm.
So like lots of companies now are using like the donut
Yeah.
installation on Slack, and like that's a good first step. I would say a better second step is
Hmm.
like the leadership team dedicating time on the calendar for those donut buddies to happen, and
Hmm.
them doing those donut buddies themselves, and the CEO sharing like a screen grab of their Zoom conversation in
Yeah.
Slack and showing like, oh, this is one fun fact I learned about this person. And that's how
Hmm.
you can take something that everybody uses to the next level of intentionality and show your employees that you stand behind this as an organization, and the socialization time's important. So,
Yeah.
so that's just one example.
I love that. I think um, we can both acknowledge that like it takes a lot of work is kind of the answer.
Yeah.
um, but it like the return on investment is huge, and the like place that you can create for people is huge. I'd be curious what advice you might give to someone who is working in people ops and who is
Mhm.
working on building these systems and is like working on that executive buy-in and asking their CEO to talk about how they use Donut. What advice would you give to someone who's meeting some resistance or is having trouble, um, maybe helping leadership executive team understand like why this work is so important and why it's important that they show that they're behind it?
Yeah, I think it's really important to like earn a seat and have a seat at that
Hmm.
virtual table. And so I mean, there's plenty of statistics out there around like the cost of hiring a new employee versus keeping an employee.
Hmm.
Like what happens when really intelligent, hardworking people leave organizations and the cultural impact it can have on their teammates, and
Yeah.
how you replace not only that person, but like that single source of failure in terms of
Mm.
knowledge they have, why people leave jobs and organizations, usually around like management and culture. And
Yep.
all of that comes down to areas of expertise that people ops people have. And instead of reacting to those things, again, this kind
Hmm.
of goes back to the definition, instead of reacting to those things as they happen, proactively sitting down with the leadership team and talking about like, what do we want to make our organization so that we can set the expectations with potential candidates, with new employees, starting from the hire date, starting from
Mm.
onboarding, in terms of like, how do we make decisions here? What acceptable behaviors exist at work? How are we going to recognize people? What mental models do we want to use and celebrate in the organization? And I think even sometimes talking about those things and the impact on the product, the impact
Yep.
on revenue, um, creates a lot of urgency and a sense of being serious, even though
Hmm.
like we naturally know this stuff is serious and this stuff is really good. I think sometimes it takes the stark truth of numbers to really shift someone's opinion.
Mm.
um and just like, it does also make rational sense. If your employees are really stressed out and they
Yep.
don't feel connected to each other, why would they want to help each other in a bind? Why would they want to work extra hours to get like this launch done so
Hmm.
that you're ahead of schedule or you're surprising and delighting customers? Like the way you get people to be excited about your company is to be excited about them and
Hmm.
treat them right.
Cool. I love that. I think kind of maybe a question to just like close this out, because you spend so much time thinking about remote teams and culture,
Mm-hmm.
is like, what if someone was like, give me one piece of advice about building a
Yeah.
remote team? Um, what comes to mind for you?
Set clear expectations always. I
Mm.
think mismatched expectations is like the root of all evil.
Hmm.
So whether it's at a company level or an individual level, having people be clear on what they're expecting from their peers, from their managers, from their employees is the most important thing. And you can't just fake it in remote work. So you have to be really proactive and intentional about setting those expectations, which are like keywords I use a lot, but they're
Mm.
really like near and dear to my heart.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think, uh, to sum up some of the things you were saying, those like cracks in your culture can't be covered up by benefits, ping pong table, ball pit, when you're remote. And so like having those conversations and setting those clear expectations becomes so much more important.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. I really appreciate you joining me in this conversation today, Ali. It's interesting hearing um, kind of how you view both people ops and remote work and how they work together.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm excited for this opportunity and hope your listeners are able to come away with like a few pieces of inspiration for their people ops journey.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to include a link to the book you're working on too. It sounds really interesting.
Awesome. Sounds good.